Halo, Pak Jo, Pak Andrew. Hello, how are you? It's been a while.
Yeah, that's okay. Thanks. Hai Mbak Nila, apa kabar?
Halo, baik. Mas Sirot hasn't joined yet. Um, Remind him. Wait.
That's it. That's okay. How are things going with your with it?
Yep. Um, the the deadline should be on October 7 for the draft of inception paper. It would be about the our research design or anything that we already um, analyze. So we are preparing for that. But in quantitative part, we have been trying to do the regional analysis, developing the CCPA index. Yeah, but
Yeah.
for the qualitative part, mostly we've just done the literature review and the policy review. But actually, we have to kind of audience or meeting with Bapnas, with Bu Fifi, the one who gave us sponsor for this project. So we need to prepare like some kind of presentation or something to her, and we haven't prepared for it yet. So I think um, the um, the urgent one is the research design, particularly for the qualitative part. Actually, the core method of this project is the qualitative part. So we really need your advice on that part. Sorry for the delay to send the document, the metrics. So hopefully um you had chance to read through or uh just
Yeah.
watch. Yeah.
So thanks for that. I can see you've done an enormous amount of work, and I can see it's a quite complex document. So um, maybe just before everyone else joins,
Yes.
just curious to know. I can understand these vulnerability X's, these vulnerability indexes are very common. But I'm interested in your thinking behind why. Uh, um, well, firstly, I think I can see most of vulnerability assessments do this kind of thing. But I'm just interested in your thoughts about, does the government ask you to create a vulnerability index?
Not precisely. At the regional level, it's just give us maybe hints or consideration to pick the district for
Right.
our in-depth study. And for the household level, actually, it's just a simplified way to identify who is the vulnerable, which group are vulnerable more compared to the others. But identification of who are the vulnerable will be completed or will be combined with the qualitative approach. Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
but the
Yeah.
more yeah yeah
Sorry,
yes.
go ahead.
Yeah. But the thing is, actually, any analysis in the first part of the identification of the vulnerable people, uh, I mean, in the quantitative part, is related to the second objective, yeah, to how to integrate the vulnerable people to the ISP system, adaptive social protection system. That's the thing, and that's we just read some literatures on the targeting mechanism under adaptive social protection, but we still don't know how, based on our data collection, then we can, uh, you know, utilize it to, give suggestion to government how to target the vulnerable people to climate change.
Yeah, because I can see you want to use PODES and SUSANAS and
Yep.
other data. So that suggests you're going to look at a wide set of variables
Yes.
to look at vulnerability. But I guess the only thing when I saw on your topic coverage on the right-hand side, sorry, we probably should be waiting for everyone else, but I was just, while we're waiting, I was just trying to understand your philosophy of thinking here.
Yeah.
I can see if you look down on the second frame, you're going to look at a wide range of things like housing and assets, demographic characteristics. Yeah.
You mean for the household level analysis?
No, I'm thinking about the quantitative one for the index.
Yeah, but for at the regional level or at the household level analysis?
Well, maybe you're going to have to go through it and explain a little.
Okay.
But I was just looking at the first set of the first table, the one called the quantitative one.
Yes. Should
Hi,
I?
Andrew.
Yeah, hi. Can you send me that? I haven't got the copy of that. I couldn't download it.
I can email it to you, Andrew.
Yeah, would you mind?
Yeah, I've just got it here. Let me do that.
Yeah. So maybe I can maybe just walk through briefly on this part. So basically for the quantitative part, we are working in both questions about who are the vulnerable and how to integrate them into the ISP system. But for the first question, we only focus on who are the vulnerable and to what degree. And we are going to do it in two levels. The first one in regional level. By regional level means across districts within these two islands, and at the household level. So the wider one is at the regional level, where we use the secondary data, SUSUNAS, PODES, and everything. Particularly for the exposure part, we're using the satellite data. Sorry. And for the household level, it is mainly sourced from the survey, the household survey.
Right.
So yes, so the main objective for the regional level is just map the vulnerability level across districts, and as a context for our household analysis or community analysis later, and as part of the guidance to select the districts for our in-depth analysis later.
Right.
Yeah. So this one is the topic coverage. But for the household level, we are not sure yet about the coverage. What questions we are going to raise in the questionnaire for household.
Okay, could I just ask you a question then related to this one?
Yes.
If you got up the top a little bit, if you scroll up.
Scroll up, yeah.
Yeah, if you look over here on the left, who are vulnerable and to what degree? So this is talking about who is vulnerable to climate change, yeah?
Yes.
Right. So it's talking about outcome vulnerability, yeah?
Yeah, for the quantitative part, yes.
All right. Okay. So that maybe you need to see in the question. Maybe you could, in the box on the far left, question A.
Yeah.
If you go
far
up the
left or far right?
If you go up the top.
On top, yes.
See question A, who are vulnerable and to what degree? Maybe you could just specify there in that box that you're talking here about outcome vulnerability, because I think you said in the earlier document you want to do both outcome vulnerability and contextual vulnerability.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's fine to do that, but it's just good to clarify that this is really looking at the climate coming down and affecting people's livelihoods, whereas maybe the other question is looking more at the kind of contextual
context, yes.
The second one, number B.
Oh, you mean?
If I understand you correctly.
Yeah.
Hang on. So, hang on. If you go up to the top. So I think you've said earlier in your document that you want to look at both forms of vulnerability.
Yes.
But this question is only really looking at the outcome, which is okay because you're going to look at the other sort of vulnerability in the other question. Yeah. So this one's just purely looking at the climate change. So in this one.
Yeah. So what we think currently is for the quantitative one, then we focus for the outcome vulnerability, but then at the qualitative part, we focus on the contextual vulnerability. What do you think about it? Or should we, in both quantitative and qualitative, we better just to use contextual vulnerability?
Well, so when I first looked at it, I thought this question 1A, you're looking at the outcome vulnerability, but then as you go down a little bit further into that the next row, where you talk about using the Susanas data and the Podex. Where's that? Yeah, because when you look at the Susanas and the Podex, you'll get more data about the contextual vulnerability. You know, who is vulnerable in those contexts with it before climate change comes along.
Yeah, but well, in terms of variable, yes, but in terms of methodology, actually, it's still considered as outcome vulnerability because it's still top down from the from the exposure to climate change and then their sensitivity to climate change impact and then the adaptive capacity. What I'm understanding between the outcome and contextual, the outcome vulnerability, it's like linear from the climate change to the vulnerability. But for the contextual vulnerability, the relation is interchangeable, between the adaptive capacity and the vulnerability and with the sensitivity. It's interrelation each other. But in terms of outcome, vulnerability is just, linear down.
Well, that's one way of understanding it. There's a few different there's different theories about it. I know that's one way. But maybe it's more, if you want to think about it that way, then this is more a question of sensitivity in that the communities that are already poor, the ones that have got, in other ways, they've already got vulnerability, so they're more sensitive.
Yes, yes.
So you've got a lot of data in the Susanas and the Podex about those people. They're already vulnerable. I mean, there's a lot of theory now in the literature. The people who are already vulnerable are most likely to be the most affected. In other words, they're the ones who are most sensitive to any kind of. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it, both life. I think we can do that. So when we develop the index, it mostly just outcome vulnerability. But then in the next analysis, then we can use the interaction, like what is things that determine their vulnerability. Like then we can use the demographic characteristics or like welfare or asset indicators then to define which are vulnerable more compared to others.
I wonder if could I share you a document here? Because I have
sure.
a document. Let me just.
I think you are allowed to share.
If I can make it bigger. So.
Okay, you can share it.
So there are different theoretical frameworks for thinking about this. So I don't want to get too caught up because we all use different ones. But can you see that picture?
Yes.
So sensitivity is the degree to which a system or a person is affected or either adversely or beneficially by climate variability or change. So the degree to which a person is going to be affected is going to be very much related to the characteristics of the household, if you understand what I mean. And some people call that sensitivity and other bodies of literature call that vulnerability. So let's not get caught up in the definition.
Okay.
But I think a lot of your quantitative data from the Susanas will talk about who is already vulnerable. So, for instance, people on low income that are dependent, have got very little land or who are in precarious labor, precarious forms of work, or in the Andrews fishing communities, people who are who don't have their own boats and are heavily in debt. Those sorts of people are going to be more vulnerable, or if you want to use these terms, they're going to be more sensitive to change. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So you can use different words. It depends on how you want to define the term vulnerability. But that would be my understanding. You could talk about their great degree of sensitivity, or you could talk about their greater vulnerability. So it depends on how you want to define those terms. So this would come back to, the paper I shared you on differential vulnerability.
Yeah.
So, but there's different frameworks and different terms. So I don't want to get too caught up on that. So I think you're broadly right that, you know, we can talk about outcome of vulnerability in terms of, but because it's things coming together, so if they're already vulnerable, they're going to be even more vulnerable. Or you could say they're more sensitive. It just depends which
Yes.
language you prefer. So
Yeah.
does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. And I think later in the further analysis, then we need to break it down between the exposure sensitivity and the adaptive capacity to dig more which part contributes more to their overall vulnerability, I guess.
Right. Yeah. So, or another way of thinking about it is those people that are more vulnerable in a more anthropological sense, they have less capacity to adapt. So it's all interconnected, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I wonder whether, if you go back to your table there,
Okay.
so I like the table. I think it's a really nice way of thinking it through. So
Yeah.
I just wonder whether you want to mine some of the data you have from the Susanas and from the PODES about which kinds of households you think might be more vulnerable quantitatively. Would it be possible to do something like that, or is it a lot of work?
Actually, we are planning to do that with our household survey, but I think we also can do that with secondary data.
Yeah, I guess you don't want to make it undoable. So maybe it might be a lot of work. I guess that's the question, how much work you can do. But
Well, yes. Well, we have plenty of time later after the inception paper.
you've got all those points there in the box number. See that box you've got highlighted, the next one down.
Oh, yes.
Hang on, you go back up. You just where you were just then, you didn't have to move. You went back up a little bit.
A bit.
See that box that you were just showing? The one you just had open. I don't know where it's gone now.
Which one?
The one you just, before you moved, then you had another box. You had a box I could see.
At the quantitative part?
Yeah, the one you just had open.
I mean this one.
Yeah, see that box where you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? This is already what we're talking about. You know, which households in terms of demographic characteristics, employment, or I mean, they've already got all this data, haven't they, about who's to some degree, it's not 100% accurate, but it shows degrees of vulnerability, I think, or shows degrees of at least impoverishment.
Sorry, I missed your last words.
So in the PODES and the other data, they have data on, who is depending on insecure labor, who is got leased land, who is, these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So using the secondary data, we definitely can do the analysis, but only the level of analysis is limited.
Right.
So as long as we do it in the in the regional level, district level at most, then yeah, we can do the analysis. But from the household survey, we are trying to do the analysis more, more closing up, like depending, we can divide when we try to identify who are more vulnerable than others in using secondary data, we only can divide them by district, by location, but not with or with general characteristics, but not with maybe in certain characteristics, like by dryland farmers and fisheries, for example. We can do that with the secondary data.
Yeah, that makes sense. It only takes you so far, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that could be interesting for the government to know how far their data takes you,
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? It could be part of our contribution to show that their data doesn't take us very far, or how far does it take it, and then what kind of data you need to actually, or what kind of understanding you need to help impoverished people.
Yes, that's related with the our second objective, yeah.
Right.
The targeting mechanism, or what kind of indicators that the government needs in order to capture the vulnerable people.
Right.
If the data available in the from BPS, then that's good. But if they need additional data based on our survey here, then they need another mechanism to survey, either from their unified database or something else.
Right. Okay. So yeah, that could be, if it's not too much work. If it's a lot of work, maybe we can't do that. Oh, Masiro is there now.
Yes, yes. Um, we had
Yes, Pak John.
some
Hello,
discussion with
Masiro.
Mas Sirot
Halo
before.
Pak John, halo Pak Andrew.
Hello, Mas Sirot.
Ya, halo.
Mas Sirot gave us some insight in the qualitative part when we were lost. So Mas Sirot suggests us to read through the literatures on the adaptive social protection instruments in order to give us some kind of, ideas for the our second objective. Yeah.
So which one is the second objective again now?
Second objective is the one. How can adaptive social protection accommodate these vulnerable people, and how can it support their capacities? So in terms, when we are trying to integrate the adaptation plans into adaptive social protection system, precisely what kind of instruments that the adaptive social protection can provide according to other countries. So Mas Sirot suggests us to read through the literatures, and the last sheet here is some summary that we found.
Right. Okay. So where would you like to start our discussion?
Particularly for the qualitative part, that's what we have been thinking, but as you can see here, for the technical analysis, we haven't thought much on it, so we just put it qualitative analysis. Only for the meta-analysis that we can thinking about when we try to mapping and identify the availability of current social protection schemes. We can do like meta-analysis, but for the first objective, to identify who are vulnerable, why they are vulnerable, and how climate change deepen the other vulnerabilities, we don't know how to analyze our information.
Okay. So hang on. So what was that last one? I was just looking at something else when you said that.
The last one is how to address the first question about who are the vulnerable, why, and how climate change deepen other forms of vulnerability. We don't know how to analyze the information, but for the scope of primary data collection, you can see here at the topic of publish here.
So I wonder whether we could think about our steps. So there's a lot of literature on these climate adaptation and the steps. So I think what you've done is a really nice job at developing a risk assessment or something like that. But a lot of these literature also talks about an impact chain development. So what an impact chain is, from my understanding, is we think about, if I could find an example, I was just trying to look on the internet if I could find a picture. So if we think about what leads to what, which leads to what, if you understand what I mean. Like, I mean, Andrew's fishing case in our book is a good example, that you might get this leads to this, which leads to this, which leads to this, if you know what I mean.
Oh,
so
yeah, it's like chain, yeah. That's why it's
like
called
a
chain.
Yeah. So I just looking on the internet, I just found one. Just let's see if I can make it big. I just found an example of one. Just see if I can bring it up. So there's lots of these impact chain analyses on the internet. I'll just see if I can find an example of one quickly. There was a picture here somewhere. It's a paper on, here we go. Okay, so this is, this is from Pakistan, but I'll just share it anyway. So this is saying, you know, that intensive, can you see that?
Yeah.
So we have intensive monsoon rains, and we have sensitivity. They're more sensitive because of deforestation. And then we get impact, which leads to vulnerability. And then you can get the potential for, you see what I mean? Like a sort of little, and that could orientate our analysis. And I mean, you could do this both for outcome vulnerability and for contextual vulnerability. Maybe you need to do some focus group discussions or something. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yes, makes sense. And for the contextual vulnerability, then the items would be more than this one, with this one, because there is structural things in terms of political, economy, and social structure. Then we can put additional items in here in order to find the impact chain.
Right. I mean, maybe, you know, I mean, Andrew could probably develop you one, or someone else on fisheries, but you could probably sort of map out what these kind of causalities are, and that might help shape our qualitative research, but it might be involve some, what do you think, Andrew? You're on mute, Andrew.
Or it'd be good to have some scenarios, to consider scenarios first, and then see if we could kind of you know, coordinate them, develop them into an approach.
Like the scenarios like in your book?
Well, the scenarios in our book are maybe a little bit too complex.
Yes.
I mean, we could keep them in the back of our mind. I don't know what, Andrew.
Well, I think, you know, in the different livelihood scenarios, there's a range of risks, I suppose. And if you start risks and vulnerabilities that are related, and then I think if you just keep that in mind, that helps you imagine what sorts of impacts might occur.
Would you elaborate more on the livelihood scenarios? I mean, like examples, the less complex one, not like in your book.
Well, I think maybe you could do it in two different ways. You could do it in terms of outcome vulnerabilities, like the one I showed you, but you could do it in the way Andrew was talking about, with trying to think about more of the complexities. And I think it's important to probably have those two in your mind. I don't know, what do you think, Andrew?
No, I think so. Yeah, I mean, like different livelihoods will, in different locations, will be at risk of different kinds of impacts, deleterious impacts, right? That's logical. It would be good to have a sense of that. Rather than starting with a clean slate, we should be able to imagine what those risks might be, given that we understand the nature of the livelihood. And there'll be a range of things, right? There'll be the physical, climatic, there'll be economic, there'll be political, there's a range of things, right, that will impact upon these livelihoods potentially.
And I think from my reading of these vulnerability assessments, it's really important to focus your study, because else it becomes just too many things to collect. So we could kind of, otherwise we're just looking at everything and it just becomes unworkable. I mean, that would be my concern. So with the quantitative data, we got almost a range of variables, but then when it comes to trying to home in on what we're trying to understand, it might be useful to try and develop something like this.
So you mean by the scenarios is in terms of the risk, or in terms of the type of livelihood? So, or types of livelihood in certain times?
So could you go to your spreadsheet again? Sorry to cut you off there. I think you had some of this in your spreadsheet for the qualitative. So here we put many more
things compared to the outcome one, like the political capacity, social process, cultural knowledge.
So if you go up the very top at the question on the very left,
Yes.
why are they vulnerable?
Mhm.
So the why question suggests we try and make, and this is what these vulnerability assessments do, they kind of try to map out the mechanisms.
Of the mechanism. And the mechanism would refer to this range of topic.
Well, I mean, I think that range of topics is a good list of things to keep in mind when you do the analysis. But maybe when you do some kind of trying to look at, like the one I showed you from Pakistan, you probably can just try and simplify and see what leads to what. And then you can, otherwise you've got a long list of things.
Yeah. But therefore, that's at the analysis stage. But at the data collection stage, do you think we still need to try to dig in all these considering aspects, or we can limit to certain aspects from the beginning?
Well,
in terms of data collection.
So from what I've read on these vulnerability assessments that are pretty universal, one of the main things a lot of the literature talks about is trying to narrow down your approach to stop it becoming unworkable. And one of the things that they suggest to do is these, and what was the term I used? Impact chain analysis. So, and you can look at, you know, there's various guides that talk about the steps you go through, and I think you've been following most of these steps, but this is one step I think maybe we could put in. So, so that one paper I came, for instance, talks about standardized vulnerability assessment in 8 steps. So it talks about preparing the vulnerability assessment, and step 2 is developing impact chains, and then 3rd is identifying and selecting indicators. And 4th is data sources and data acquisition, and so on. So I think those impact chains could be really helpful for us in trying to work out what we really need to understand. What do you think?
That sounds a nice paper. Would you send it to us?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll put it in the, I mean, there's many papers like this. I don't know whether this is the best one. It just seemed to have a nice diagram when.
Yeah, and there is like steps by steps.
So this one is from 2021, so it's quite recent. I'll put it in the chat.
The mechanism, John, here is, what is that? When they say mechanism.
Well, that was a term I used, but I think the thing is most of the literature only talks about the outcome vulnerability. They like to talk about the other form of vulnerability, but because the field is dominated by physical scientists, they tend to forget the things that we as social scientists also look at. So I just think we need to be a little bit careful to, the better discussions on vulnerability analysis talk about the need to do both. And I think we're doing both quantitative and qualitative. We should be able to do both. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, I guess that's right. I mean, they're going to be somewhat different exercises, of course. But...
Well, I mean, the reality is that climate does impact people's vulnerabilities. So there is, to some degree, a linear relationship. But we know as social scientists that, you know, I mean, that famous article by Jesse Ribot that vulnerability does not fall from the sky. Do you know that article? Maybe Masiro might know that article.
Yeah.
It's a famous article I use in my teaching. I love the title. I'll put it in here. I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, very provocative title, yeah.
It's a bit conceptual.
You mean controversial or
There's it.
conceptual?
Conceptual.
Oh, conceptual. Okay.
But
vulnerability doesn't fall from the sky, but I think privilege is.
you think what is?
Privilege does fall from the sky.
All right.
Privilege.
Yeah.
So he's arguing that people are already vulnerable. So look, here's where is it? I had something that was a really nice summary of this. Here, this one. So in our book, we tried to think about all the different mechanisms that lead to vulnerability. So we were more in the conceptual vulnerability sort of tradition, but we can see the need for also outcome vulnerability analysis.
Sorry, I just copied your text, your chat. Sorry, what did I miss?
Yeah, anyway, please go ahead. You want to talk us through your spreadsheet? Please go ahead. We don't want to, I think you've done a lot of great work here, so we will.
Yes, so our first concern is about the technical analysis, and you already suggest some technique, and we will read through more about it. And the other one is the primary data collection method. The first concern is when we are trying to identify how the climate change or the biophysical impact the communities, and what do you think that the people at the root level can understand it, when we are trying to dig how the climate change impact your life, your livelihood. Do you have any suggestion, another way to dig that information from the people at the grassroots? I believe they do not understand about the climate change per se.
Excuse me, I just got to take this call because I'm waiting for someone to come out of hospital. So.
Oh, yeah. Maybe Andrew or...
Yeah, Neela, well, I think they may not understand the, drivers or whatever of climate change. They only experience the impacts. And
the manifestation of the
change on their livelihood, I guess. Now, they won't know for sure, what the reasons for that is, or indeed how to deal with it. But that will clearly may have an impact on them. Like, I mean, it could, I think in terms of, you would think something like drought, right? Drought or too much rain or rain at the wrong time, those sorts of things are going to be immediately obvious to people who are farming, right? But so, I mean, the thing is, how would you mitigate that is not obvious, because it just depends on I think it depends on your resources, really, or the extent of your resources. I mean, most farmers can lose a crop, but you don't want to lose two in a row, for example. So there are degrees of resilience, right, around, or adaptive capacity. So the question here that I wanted to raise, though, was there are a lot of factors that might threaten someone's livelihood, climate change being one, but a rather diffuse kind of force or impact, because it's not something that's, how do I say that? It's a very broad impact. It's not something that you can really address in any direct way. You can only cope with it, right?
Yeah. Another thing is the difference between climate change and disaster. Climate change is like in the long term, that maybe the impact that they feel is kind of gradually. But do you think unless it becomes disaster, becomes like flash flood or maybe long drought, maybe they can feel it, they can understand it, but the effect of climate change is kind of a gradual.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
I think though, because I was just in Flores, I think, and this year is going to be El Nino, so I mean, what the sense I got in Flores is that things are progressively getting much more variable, and they're having much more harvest failures. So, as Andrew talked about it, people are very aware of it. And this year in Australia, we're getting ready for a very bad El Nino year. And I think a lot of people in Eastern Indonesia are also worried about this. So I don't think it's as studies maybe 5 years ago might have said, oh, it's a bit diffuse, but I think it's getting sharper and sharper because people are having more and more harvest failures.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So
What we are thinking is when we try to capture the impact of climate change, we are going to use a seasonal calendar and historical timeline. But what we are not sure yet is for how long, for how many years back we are trying to capture the seasonal change. And
right.
according to your study, when people in Flores getting more crop failures, crop failures, it's in terms of how long, how many years compared to.
So I think you probably can do focus group discussions on that with the farmers. It's going to vary from place to place, I guess.
Yeah. There's always been failures, so it's more of a sense of an increased pattern of failure. Maybe there's always been crop failures, though, because these areas are subject to variability, climatic variability. Always have been. It's just that it's getting more intense and therefore less predictable.
When we're talking about the less predictable, does it include the period of plantation, penanaman, not only in terms of the crops, the harvest, but also the changeable patterns in terms of waktu tanam?
So I imagine it will depend on a large number of things, including what they grow, what kind of ecosystem they're in, how the seasons have been going. There'll be a lot of things to think about there. So I think when you employ those several methods you mentioned in your data collection, I think it should come out in the analysis.
Harvesting, yeah.
Well, harvest failures.
Harvest.
I mean, the other thing in Eastern Indonesia is a lot of people who are, of course, going to Kalimantan or somewhere else because they can't earn a good living in agriculture. So we probably need to think about their migration pathways a bit as well.
Yeah, that's another thing about migration. It's because in literature they said that migration is one of the coping strategy.
Right.
Yeah. I think we need to include it in the qualitative approach when we are trying to study it. Yeah. But I'm not sure for the quantitative part.
So is there good quantitative data on the degree to which people are migrating?
No. For the secondary data, no, but we're not sure for the questionnaire for household survey. Should we include the questions on migration or not?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but only the only weather-related, climate-related migration, maybe. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people will be migrating to labour to secure jobs elsewhere, I suspect, rather than escaping climate, climate pressures.
Well, I think the thing is that these pathways are very complex.
Yes, indeed.
So people might have been already migrating to avoid existing forms of vulnerability, but are they migrating more now that things are becoming even more precarious?
That's the question. Very difficult to measure, I suspect.
But maybe this is maybe we can point to a whole range of things that are missed out in the data, so the government can open their thinking a little bit more to other approaches, because I think there's a lot of things that the data tells you very well, but there are other things that it misses. And so we need to encourage them to think outside the data box, so to speak. What do you think, Masiro? You haven't been saying a lot.
Just 1 second.
Masirot?
Yes, Pak John. I'm still trying to figure out understanding the complex table that's made by by Lala. I get
Right.
your point, but somehow I try to put in the context of the this huge table. So on the last point, I'm sorry I didn't get your exact point. What I was thinking is that given the plan, which is now actually really exhaustive, right? I think in the qualitative side, I think it's better to focus on the second questions rather than
The first one, the who
yeah, rather than repeating many questions about who
and what degree.
vulnerable and why they're vulnerable.
Oh, well, we didn't address for the why part. So for the who and to what degree, maybe to some extent quantitative already addressed it, but for the why, not yet. So we need to rely more on qualitative.
Okay, okay.
So I think the why question is probably better to answer with focus group discussion to some degree.
Yes.
And then that leaves the who question for the survey. Is that what you mean, Masiro?
Yes. So now what I'm thinking is that actually the core of the question, given the subject is developing adaptive social protection, I think the core is how people might deal with the climate change vulnerability and how government can develop adaptive social protection. I think that's the core, right? A better understanding of vulnerability is one step required to answer the questions. But I think the core is not vulnerability itself, but how the people and the government develop adaptive social protection. So so far we have discussed more about the vulnerability, which is good. Now we have many things to do with the vulnerability, but actually the core is how to develop adaptive social protection. I think that's the goal. So the question of why they're vulnerable somehow serve as the bridge between the basic understanding of vulnerability. But again, we need to pay more attention and into how we develop adaptive social protection. I think that's the thing that we need to go forward.
I think that makes sense, actually.
Yeah, it's a good
Right?
point.
So maybe the qualitative path. So if we say that the quantitative part is to help us better understand the core question about vulnerability, so the qualitative is the maybe better served to understand how can we develop adaptive social protection. I think that's if we might assign the task between these two methods. And somehow there is a bridge between these two, and I think the bridge is developed better by asking why they are vulnerable, and Lala has outlined, identified here the options of adaptation, something like that, Lala, right?
Masiro, can I just drop in there?
Yes, sure.
Yes, good. I think it's a great point to look at that. And you can then ask, like in a more generic sense, what are the commonly experienced vulnerabilities of this community? Commonly experienced, points during the year when they face significant, impact. So, for instance, if the crop fails, then there's a period of time when they would normally be harvesting that they can't, or their harvest is very low. At that point, the vulnerability is significant. because they don't have food for the the next period. So that would be a really clear marker, it seems to me, where the adaptive social protection would, light up, as it were, or would come into play. What about that?
Yes.
I mean, I think that makes sense, but I guess in a way too, part of it is about trying to think about how people deal with their vulnerability. And so it could be a matter of understanding the seasonality of their vulnerability so that you could design, I mean, this social scientist in the Devereaux in the United Kingdom, he's produced this little map on social protection that talks about the different forms of social protection that you can have for different forms of vulnerability. So, if they have vulnerability, seasonal vulnerability in a particular time of the year, then you could use particular kinds of techniques, depending on the form of the vulnerability. So, I mean, conditional cash transfers that come 4 times a year may not be so well adaptive if they're always experiencing maximum vulnerability at the end of the dry season or at the top of the wet season when they can't go to sea. You know what I mean? So if we can kind of map the different sorts of vulnerability that they have, we can then think about what kind of instruments fit. Maybe there's a period of time when there's just no income. Well, that's when you might provide work opportunities. What is it? What they called cash income, income-based sort of interventions. I don't know. There's all sorts of different tools out there.
Yeah. Who was that? What was that reference, John?
I'll see if I can get it up. I use it in one of my teaching things.
So, Pak John and Pak Andrew, this is the way I think, Pak John. So, when we focus on the developing adaptive social protection, we might distinguish between the two things. One is that we think the adaptive social protection in technocratic way, and the second thing is somehow we develop bottom up from the way people understand their reality. The first, what I call as technocratic way, we try to map in the first place the people vulnerability, and then from let's say technocratic expertise, we can say, okay, if this is the way people vulnerable, we can suggest, okay, let's give the scheme, the new scheme or the additional scheme in this way. That one way to develop the adaptive social protection. The second way is that we ask people, how do they deal with their problems? How do they cope with the problems? And how they, let's say, how they perceive the benefits of the existing social protection to their problems and what they think about the improvement that should be made by the government. Somehow the elements are the same, and somehow the elements of the question have been laid out by Lala here. But the way we arrange these elements and frame them can be different. That's what I have in my mind. And I think the better way is the second one, how we ask them, how people at the local level, they let's say they cope with their problem, and what they think that the government should, if they need some help, how the government should help with them. That's how we might frame all the information that will be collected by the team here.
So you're saying look at where the government is where the government is trying to intervene, and then look at what the community thinks and try and see how we can get them.
Yes. Rather than the first way, maybe what we're thinking is not exactly the same as what I classify, but somehow there can be conceptual differences in the way adaptive social protection can be developed.
Yeah, Mashirus, I think this, the first way is easier. Yeah. The second one is better but more difficult. But the second one is what we are going to do by identification of adaptation options by the using community analysis. We are basically asking the people during FGD or something to identify seasonality. I agree with John. So then we can have like a seasonal calendar in terms of vulnerability and then what they need, or maybe the usual coping strategy that they do, and then what they need to to support them, and then we can match it with the technocratical approach. Yeah, what the government can provide to support the coping strategy or the adaptation planning that people usually develop. Is that what you mean, Mas Siroj?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds good, I think, that summary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And another thing about adaptive social protection is the transformative instruments, yeah, which makes ISP different with conventional social protection, which mostly rely on like protective instruments like bantuan sosial, yeah, social assistance. But the difference of the ISP is on the transformative aspect, which is trying to address the root causes of people vulnerability in terms of the climate change. So I think at this part, our contextual vulnerability will serve that purpose. So by using contextual vulnerability, then we can identify another things, structural things that maybe affect people adaptive capacity. Yeah. So then.
So Pak John and Pak Andrew, last week when we had discussion with the team, when we think about the adaptive social protection, we think we identify at least two things. One is that how we integrate those vulnerable to climate change, to the existing social protection system. That's one thing. The second thing is how to develop what we call as adaptive social protection. The first question might be a part of the second, but it can be what we call as adaptive social protection can be something different from the existing one, right? So we think about how we address the question, the second question, in terms of how we operationalize this question into the instrument. That now we are asking how the government can develop adaptive social protection by including these two elements, whether integrating the vulnerable into the system, and whether it also include the development of new system which accommodate not only the people but also the new challenges, the new problems caused by the climate change. That's the way last week we had the meeting. Right? Is that right? What we talk all, Lala?
Yes. Particularly for the transformative parts, yeah. That's the most difficult one. Even literatures agree on that among ISP that countries claim that they have ISP, but mostly it's on the protective, preventive, and then promotive part. But for the transformative parts, it's quite limited countries that have some kind of instruments. The only one I find is where they have a program to securing access to lands for landless farmers. That's because the landlessness is the underlying causes of vulnerability to climate change. So actually, for that part, the instrument, it could be anything, but that thing must be the root causes of their vulnerability.
Could I just say something here? I think those points are important. I think part of the story too is to identify, so for instance, what the existing forms of social protection tend to look at are things like, orphans, widows, the elderly, women with children, these sorts of vulnerable groups. But what they don't tend to look at is the fact that people who are cash crop farmers in a rain-fed agricultural system, or people with particular kind of production vulnerabilities are going to be rendered even more vulnerable by climate change. So we need to understand who in those communities are most vulnerable and what what are they kind of vulnerable to, and then design interventions that really talk to the kinds of vulnerabilities that they have. So those two things, the adaptive part and the analysis of, I gave you that paper on differential vulnerability. So that those papers on differential vulnerability are saying that vulnerability is differentiated. In other words, people within communities, particular groups of people who are rendered vulnerable already, and these people are the ones that we need to help the most. So if we understand the link, that link, then we can then design interventions to help them. And I think whether it's transformative or not is, given the scale of the problem in Eastern Indonesia now, transformative vulnerability is going to be, needs to be thought about, but that's probably the next step, isn't it? Don't you think?
I think it's more.
Sorry?
I think it's more realistic.
Sorry, so Pak John, by saying that, you mean that actually what we can do more realistically at this point is we focus on the vulnerability aspect of these people, and something like mapping out the different potential or different rooms for the government to do something to help these people, let's say, came out of the vulnerability.
Yeah, so I mean, in a way, you could talk about it. I have a PhD student who uses this concept of exclusion by design. In other words, the design of social protection systems often leaves particular groups of people outside of them. And one of the problems with the existing system, for its virtues, is it doesn't really understand the grassroots forms of vulnerability faced by cash crop farmers or subsistence farmers, people who depend partly on subsistence and partly on cash crops or partly on fisheries. What these sorts of vulnerabilities that are to do with their production systems and their livelihood systems is not, the system is blind to this, because all it does is measure their income and try and work out if they need help. And it doesn't look at the variation in their income, and it doesn't look at the differential nature of their vulnerabilities. So this is what we could add to the analysis, I think. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense, but it also makes it complex, really complicated. And I'm thinking how a government would have a lot of trouble at that level of detail, a government system, to kind of generate the understandings of, through their staff networks, of that kind of degree of complexity. And I just kind of want.
Well, do you think you could simplify it to like people with cash crops and their vulnerability and like particular categories of people?
Yeah, you could. I think that's how it would have to work at a sort of national government perspective. But I'm also wondering what local government, district government can contribute to those sort of mapping processes. It would be a lot cheaper, would it not? And they should be better informed.
I think they already have some kind of system for working out where there were harvest failures, but I'm not sure how effective they are.
I don't know how effective they are responding to it. That's a point.
What system, Pak John?
So,
to capture the harvest failure?
Kalau gagal panen, petani bisa minta bantuan dari siapa?
Oh, you mean the government already has that mechanism?
So I think they've been developing mechanisms, or they are trying to develop mechanisms for thinking about this.
Oh, I see.
But I just don't know how effective they are.
Yeah. Because I read it in other country about that kind of mechanism. So it's like the what is called, I think, climate change agriculture insurance or something. So when there is a certain variation in climate change and which impact their crops, which make them crop failure, then they can ask support from the government. But the mechanism is insurance. In other country, not in Indonesia.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that we need to map out from the Ministry of Agriculture, what kind of mechanism that they already have or they are
Yeah.
currently developing.
I think that'd be useful. And they've got more people on the ground, haven't they? So there's a kind of logic, I think, of using district-based staff
Oh, yes, yes,
as a set of reporting mechanisms, at least.
yes. Because one thing about ASP system is relying more on the local governments compared to the national central government. But the thing is, the budget space of district governments mostly limited as far as they claim.
Always.
So this is why when there is a harvest failure or something, then they are expected that it considered as the national disaster, so that the central government could chip in terms of budget.
Yes.
Right. I mean, is part of this to helping the government to anticipate problems, or communities to anticipate problems, as well as being able to react to things when they happen, and then thinking about long-term interventions to build better systems. So is that what we're talking about in terms of more transformative, partly?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a transformative idea of bringing them out of vulnerability, but I just wonder how realistic that is given the kind of budgets there are.
I think when we considered, like the paper says about the differential vulnerability, when we target the most vulnerable people that usually left out from the current systems, I think it can be considered as transformative, to some extent.
I mean, when I looked at your document, I thought it was good, but I was just wondering whether we could get this done by July next year. It looks like so much to do.
That's what I'm thinking, by Jono, given the table that given by Lala, it seems very extensive, and we need to now we need to think at what extent we can do all of this.
Yes, good point.
So this comes back to the vulnerability assessment literature that always talks about the need to focus down your assessment, and or else it becomes undoable.
So we need to sample. You saying, John?
I wonder whether we should just focus down on two particular. I think you've got this somewhere, haven't you? We're looking at two particular places, or two particular production systems in one or two places each, something like that.
The last time, at the last meeting, we are talking about we will come to the 2 sub-districts in each district, and one sub-district is for dryland farmers communities, and the other sub-districts is for the fisheries or coastal communities in each district.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good approach still. That's the model. That's a smaller sample that we could develop a range of different approaches or understandings about the how you would map vulnerability and responses to that, and what would be the climatic impacts.
Yeah.
And so then you kind of replicate them or diversify them over time, right? So you build sort of models of this adaptive social protection.
Yeah, it's the more scalable one. Yeah, that's another complexities that we need to think about later, maybe. Yeah, but I think in terms of data collection, I think we are all agree on that scope. Yeah.
So I wonder whether in terms of the qualitative study, rather than listing all these topic coverages,
Yes.
whether we could kind of narrow it down somewhat.
Yeah, I agree.
It seems like an enormous number of things we're going to look at here.
Mm.
So I think if we go through those steps and we do our causal chain analysis or whatever it was called, whatever I called it before.
Impact chain.
Impact chain.
Impact chain, which a lot of these vulnerability assessments suggest we do.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
This
good.
might help us to narrow it down and then bring in some of those ideas that Sirot was talking about in terms of connecting that to potential adaptive social interventions, social protection interventions. Otherwise, it's so abstract and very broad.
I agree with that, Pak John. I think now we have let's say we have two questions, right? One is about the vulnerability, and the second is how to develop adaptive social protection. What if we allocate the survey, the quantitative analysis to answer basically the first question, and the qualitative one mostly to answer the second question? Okay, that some bridges are needed, but the in terms of the allocation of the approach, I think that will make the project more doable, I think. So we don't have to repeat the same questions as in the quantitative, in the qualitative.
Right.
Right. Certainly, somehow we might repeat something, but somehow it's to confirm whether our quantitative really capture the complexity or the nuance of the reality, or maybe there is something else not captured by the survey. I think that's when we let's say we impact change analysis, for example. Impact change analysis somehow will ask some question asked in the survey questionnaire.
Right.
Right.
So you mean use the existing quantitative data for the first stage?
Yeah. So before we do the qualitative, somehow the quantitative analysis should be conducted first, so we know at least the overall picture of the location of the study, if not the household level.
Right.
Or if we might conduct we might analyze the PODES or SUSANAS, we might have some information about the vulnerability at the local level before we conduct the either interviews, FGDs, or other qualitative stuff. Is it possible, Lala?
In terms of regional level analysis, that's possible, but for the vulnerability at household level analysis, it's would be challenges. It will be challenging because both quantitative and qualitative team will go to the sub-district at the same time, because we need to consider about the general election period. So we have a very limited window.
So I did talk. Did you go to the onboarding with Connexi about 2 weeks ago?
I'm not personally. The other team. Yeah.
They did talk about being a bit more flexible.
Oh.
Did they?
In terms of the
because of the election, Pak John?
Timeline?
So in the other Connexi project I'm involved with, we would like to ask for a bit more flexibility, because the thing is with Nusa Tenggara, they have like Pascha, and then the wet season, and then there's Ramadan, and then there's the election.
Comes in a row.
And they all almost every month there's one of them. And then I don't know about I don't know which part of NTT we want to be, but there'll be other things as well. Like in Flores, they do Ascension Day. They have about a 5-day holiday for Ascension Day.
There's so many Catholic ceremonies. Yeah.
So it depends on where you are, but and even though parts of NTT mightn't be Muslim, our research teams are often Muslim, so they don't want to do it in Ramadan or Eid al-Fitr. So I don't know why they got this crazy timeline,
Yeah, it's true.
really crazy.
That
But
yeah, they actually give us flexibility. So the project should be ended by June 2024, but they give us flexibility up to August. So by the end of June, we only have to deliver the outline of our final report.
All
Only
right.
the outline.
That's good.
so I think it makes sense to do the quantitative data and keep homing.
Yeah. And then the qualitative one, yeah.
Can I ask a question? How good is the meteorological data? Does that exist for these places we want to look at? Sort of longitudinal or historical meteorological stuff.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
some data, the data are available
Okay.
So what?
for a long period of time. So, for example, 1980 until today. But some, I think the shortest data would be the ocean 2015, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Of sea surface temperature and sea level anomaly, please.
Yeah. About other variables will the availability of the other variables will be from around 1980s or 2000. So it's quite long. And if we want, we can also access the near real-time data if it's needed. So basically, some of the meteorological data is available hourly, daily.
Oh.
Yeah. But that would be too much to handle because it would require a large storage.
But I wonder if we could get access to the areas we're interested in.
Yeah, we already done that in the
the
district level, but I'm
Okay.
afraid we cannot disaggregate the data into a lower level.
All right.
So, such as sub-district or village,
Well,
maybe not. It's not possible.
does that show drought occurrence, drought frequency?
The drought,
Or,
it can show that, but we need to analyze the data first. So
yeah.
basically, we can approach that drought by we can, for example, analyze our daily precipitation. So, for example, if the number of daily precipitation is less than, so maybe 10 millimeters, it can be inferred that there is no rain at that day, and we can sum up the day to a day without rain, days without rain, and days with rain, something like that.
Mm-hmm. But just it seems to me to be quite interesting the way to tie climate change data to people's experiences is to have some good climate change information, right, to show seasonal variability and to show historical patterns that then you can kind of correlate them with people's experiences, maybe. But it has to be finer grained, I guess, than district level.
Yeah. Well, in practice, I imagine it would be difficult because, when we talk about rain, it could be raining in one village, but not raining in the other villages. So it's quite variable within the district itself. So I don't know.
What do you think, Chris, if we are going to analyze it in the district level, when we try to correlate between the exposure data related to climate change with the maybe sensitivity or the adaptive capacity indicators in district level?
Yeah, at the district level, it's highly possible to do that because yeah, the data uh, can cover that area. If we go lower than district, I'm afraid we cannot do that unless the data is has the very high resolution. So for example, there is one data that is very high that has very high resolution. So in total, there are 2 terabytes of data. It's a daily temperature, I think. One
We can break
one
it
day
down.
of data. One day of data has 700 megabytes, I think. Well, I don't think my laptop can handle that data. 2 terabytes?
You can
No,
have new laptop, Hafiz.
no.
You can ask new laptop to Lala.
To connect the yeah. So in short, we can do it in the district level, but not in the lower level. Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct.
But John, are you okay with the time you said before that you're going to pick someone at the hospital?
Oh yeah, I have to go a little while.
Yeah.
I think we're almost finished, aren't we?
Yeah. I think we need to. I agree with this one that we need to narrow down the topic coverage. I think that's our priority, and to read through more about the impact chain analysis to map out the mechanism. Well, I think that's to answer why, maybe. Yeah. Not necessarily the who is the vulnerable. Because yeah, we still need to identify who are vulnerable, at least briefly, yeah, before going deeper into the coping strategy that people usually do. Right, Masirot? Because even though we already get the idea based on the quantitative analysis, but when we try to discuss it with people in FGD, for example, we need at the same page, like in terms of who are vulnerable and the pattern of seasonal vulnerability. Yeah, Masirot.
Yeah, I think we might frame such information when collecting the information to answer specific questions different from the question posed in the survey.
Yes, agree. Yeah, so I think in terms of topic coverage, what I'm thinking now to take it out from our topic coverage is about migration coping strategy. Yeah, because in terms of social protection instruments, I think it's kind of difficult to to address. Yeah, let's say that people usually use temporary migration, for example, as coping strategy when their crop is failed. But then what social protection can do, I can't imagine any.
No, it might mean something to be done at the local level, so
Yes.
people don't need to migrate.
Yes, yeah. So they do not need to seasonal migration.
I guess it depends on whether you're wanting to. If you're wanting to be doing an economic study that's very narrowly focused, you probably leave it out. But if you want to understand people's coping strategies, you probably need to keep it in, because remittances or getting money from family members that are elsewhere in Indonesia when they have a crisis could be a key coping strategy. And so if we leave out a lot of the contextual dynamics that are shaping people's vulnerability, I mean, maybe we can talk about that later on.
Yeah.
We don't need to fixate too much on it, but
okay.
I think in terms of the focus group discussion, some of this probably will come out.
Yeah.
I mean, we did find that in some places it's a key coping strategy, whereas in other places it doesn't amount to anything. So it probably depends on where you are. Like in Andrew's fishing communities, nobody was migrating.
No, really.
But some parts of Nusa Tenggara, you have massive numbers of people leaving.
So it's part of the livelihood diversification, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. That's all from me. Maybe guys, you have something to ask to Pak John, Pak Andrew, Mas Siroj?
But can I ask, with the fieldwork program, what have you settled on that? Is that you
Which one?
clear on when you're going on doing the fieldwork?
Sorry, Pak Andrew. In terms of
In terms of actually going to these, collecting information in the villages that we're looking at.
yeah, we are planning on. Hafiz, please remind me. Is it in the end of March?
Okay.
Yeah, around that. Around February or March. I forgot the exact date.
Yeah.
15 February is the election, Hafiz.
Oh, right.
So after the election.
Yeah.
It's in when
It's
they
when
do
they calculate the result of the election.
Yeah. So maybe
What if-
towards the end of
What
February.
if we have the second round of the presidential election, Hafiz? What will happen?
Okay.
Nothing will happen because because the second round of the election would be
What time?
August. Oh
August.
no.
So
That's to. Is it? I think August, July or August.
Okay.
yeah, yeah. So we still have time, and yeah, let's hope there's only one round, but I don't think it's possible. It's highly likely that there will be two rounds of election.
So what do you think of is it possible if quantitative team go first and then
Yeah, it's
counting
possible.
qualitative?
It's possible, but we need to set the timeline to be more tight, to be tighter. So for instance, we can say at most 1 month after the survey, the data has been analyzed, and then we can present the data to the qualitative team to enhance the instruments, and then they can go to the field to do the data collection.
So it's going to work better for me.
Yes. So if we, for example,
Yes, Pak John.
Sorry, did I cut you off? I'm sorry, keep going. I was just going to say that for me later on it's better for qualitative work. So if you want to do the quantitative work first, that's going to be easier.
Okay. That's all for now. Pak John, we will definitely contact you again, particularly about the impact chain analysis.
Right. Okay.
And
No.
maybe we can discuss it in chat about the topic coverage that we need to narrow it down.
Right. Okay. I think narrowing it down will be really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's totally agree.
But thanks for all the work you've done on it. We really appreciate it that you've done all the thinking, and it's so far more advanced than it was.
Yeah. Alhamdulillah. That's all people work actually. Yes. So Pak John, thank you so much. Pak Andrew, I'm sorry, Pak John, you are going to be late to pick your friends.
Oh, that's all
Pak
right.
Andrew,
She's not getting out
thanks.
yet,
Oh, Pak Andrew,
but I have to
if
go.
Okay,
yeah,
bye-bye,
if you
Pak
have
John.
more
Thanks.
literature, particularly on the fishing or coastal, the one that you already work on, please do send us from on WhatsApp group.
Okay.
Ya.
Baik, terima kasih.
Iya.
Terima kasih ya.
Terima kasih Pak John.
Terima kasih Pak John, terima kasih Pak Andrew.
Baik,
terima
Pak
kasih.
Mas Sirot, nanti mungkin teman-teman kualitatif akan langsung kontak Mas Sirot kalau ada pertanyaan ya.
Oke.
Okay. When will the next meeting be then? Or when?
It should be maybe at the end of September. Maybe we
Okay.
can send a draft of our inception paper to you guys to have a
Okay.
quick look before
Okay.
we
Good.
send it.
Okay. See you everyone.
Oke, see you, makasih.
Makasih Pak
Mari.
Andrew, Pak
Sampai
John.
jumpa.
Sampai jumpa. Lala?
Mas Sirot, jangan
Iya.
sampai jumpa dulu.
Iya. Sekarang gimana?
Gimana teman-teman
Waduh,
kualitatif?
Pak Sultan lagi di winter, Pak.
Iya lagi winter, Pak Sultan.
Gimana
Pakai
gimana
pelindung
terapinya
leher.
Pak Sultan? Jadi dilakukan kemarin atau enggak?
Mute, Pak, mute. Mute.
Yang di Abel, yang sarannya Abel dulu, karena
Oh, I
dia
see.
pernah yang di
Iya.
Cipinong. Nanti kalau nggak beres juga ya ke tempat kamu.
Ya, siap.
Karena
Semoga.
pertimbangannya saya lihat kamu lebih lama macetnya.
Oh
Yang Bu
iya,
Anti itu
kalau ke
di
situ
mana,
lama.
Pak? Yang Bu Anti juga pernah kan? Itu di Ciputat.
Iya.
Oh, yang Bu Anti juga di Ciputat.
Saya ke
Daerah
kamar
paling
mandi.
macet.
Aku kamar mandi sebentar lah ya.
Iya, Mas.
Apa itu, Pak, penyebabnya, Pak Sultan?
Banyak
Banyak kan
kan?
duduk begini, itu nunduk, lihat laptop, lihat HP.
Emang disuruh agak mendongak sebenarnya, terlalu rendah hati Pak Sultan.
Iya, Pak.
Jadi
Kurang percaya
itu
diri,
yang
Pak
perlu.
Sultan ya.
Eh?
Kurang percaya diri.
Jadi peribahasa itu nggak berlaku sekarang ya.
Iya,
Jangan sering
benar.
ke
Salah
atas
ya.
itu sekarang
Salah.
bagus. Makanya harus diralat itu. Kan kita katanya harus selalu ngelihat ke bawah.
Heeh.
Nah, itu ini akibatnya tulang leher bermasalah.
Saraf kan Pak,
Diingkluk
bukan
terus.
tulang kan?
Saraf ya betul.
Aduh, Mbak Titi juga kayaknya juga. Aduh.
Iya,
Aduh. Mas Sukri juga katanya ya?
kepala
Kepala dia, katanya juga
kacau.
kemungkinan.
Kenapa?
Karena dia
Udah 2 minggu nggak beres.
kronis, sakit kepala kronis gitu loh. Terus
Oh,
terus udah coba ini terus dokter mempertimbangkan kemungkinan saraf. Wah,
terus
kayaknya,
sudah periksa.
sudah 2
Berarti
rangkai
kan
tes,
masih belum.
belum tegak dia. 2 minggu lagi dipantau katanya. Mbak Titi juga tangan jari-jarinya kesemutan dan bahunya kebas gitu. Wah, kenapa sih ini orang-orang? Ya Allah.
Anu ini polusi, polusi.
Dampak
Climate
perubahan
change, climate
Iya.
change, climate change.
Iya, kata gimana menurut teman-teman tadi? Aku setuju sih.
Kualitatifnya sih lebih simpel menurut saya ya. Kita aja terlalu apa ya?
Enggak,
Ya
Mbak.
terlalu
Pak,
berpedoman
sebelumnya
pada theoretical gitu loh. Jadi kayak wow. Ternyata
sebelumnya itu
simple juga.
mereka itu maunya tetap dijawab kuali juga yang tadi, makanya makasih tadi Mas Sirot
Nah, iya.
menegaskan. Tadinya memang di awal usulan kita yang kuantitatif udah sampai di situ terus dilanjutkan kualitatif untuk pencapaian berikutnya. Tapi Pak John tetap merasa kualitatif juga perlu menggali yang sama gitu.
Ya iya.
Tapi kan juga
Kalau
kayak
menggali yang sama kan jadinya banyak.
iya, sekarang yang vulnerability aja udah panjang ya. Terus padahal yang adaptation
Simple. Makanya kita udah tahu dari
panjang.
data orang miskin, orang apa itu pasti lebih vulnerable dari yang lain kan gitu. Bukan hanya soal climate change ya. Apa aja.
Berarti tadi yang kayaknya sih saya setuju ya. Jadi yang dari seasonal calendar atau historical apa sih? Satu lagi historical apa tadi ya? Bell.
Historical timeline bisa.
Nah, historical timeline itu bisa menangkap kayak
Ya.
seasonal vulnerability-nya, terus selama ini mereka mitigasinya kayak apa, terus butuh
Ya.
dukungan apa. Paling ya elaborasinya aja ya. Kalau nggak jawaban mereka butuhnya duit ya, Fis ya.
Iya, itu agak susah itu keinginannya Mas Sirot itu. Karena itu sangat tergantung sama Pak Sultan dan Abel nanti nanyanya. Karena
Ya,
kebanyakan ya mereka kan pengennya ya duit aja lah, Pak.
memang.
Duit aja, Pak,
Eksploratif.
duit. Ya duit kapan ngasihnya duit. Tapi
Tenang.
kalau
Nanti kita kasih pencerahan, Fis.
ya sip.
Itu emang elaborasinya itu yang nanti agak probingnya ya.
Probingnya yang
Probingnya itu
susah.
harus itu Bel. Ya kayak kita waktu di Itulah kemarin di laut lah.
Muter-muter dulu ya.
Akhirnya yang enggak itu kan akhirnya diceritakan juga hal-hal yang personal sampai kan gitu-gitu.
Iya, iya betul.
Kayak kita juga kerangkanya udah harus di benak kita udah ajak dulu, jadi nanti pun mereka kemana-mana kita bisa nangkep ya. Itu infonya kemana. Paling itu Bel yang dari untuk identification adaptation options itu yang partisipatif. Itu kan memang di guideline-nya itu kan komprehensif ya. Cuma itu kan nggak mungkin kita lakuin semuanya, termasuk yang cost efektif analisis itu kan jelas nggak mungkin. Jadi kayaknya mungkin dari situ juga perlu diperhatiin lagi mana yang perlu kita ambil gitu ya.
Iya. Oke.
Terus sama yang tadi tuh ya, yang topik coverage untuk melihat si kontekstualnya itu, aku nggak tahu sih, tapi pertimbangan untuk kita untuk narrowing down itu apa literatur paling ya.
Iya.
Mungkin dari yang, padahal kan kemarin itu kan si Abel tuh kan udah ngerangkum dari yang differential vulnerability paper dari Pak itu ya. Dari
Iya,
Pak
itu semua ya aku masukin tuh Mbak.
Kayaknya berarti jangan semua kali ya.
Ya semua ya.
Banyakan.
Pilihin lagi ya.
Ya, yang realistis yang pengalaman kita di lapang aja lah, Del, kurang lebih ya.
Jadi pendekatannya itu bisa kayak gini. Kalau satu topik itu tidak ditanyakan, kita masih bisa jawab nggak
Ya.
skema adaptive social protection-nya. Kalau bisa ya berarti itu nggak terlalu perlu sebenarnya. Kalau ada topik yang ketika itu kita nggak nanya, kita nggak bisa jawab pertanyaan penelitiannya itu, ya berarti itu yang harus ada.
Ya.
Itu yang dari kata Mas Sirot kemarin tuh ya, kita ngelihat ujungnya itu bayangan kita instrumen ASP-nya opsinya itu apa aja. Nah berarti nanti skopnya itu kita batasnya yang terkait sama itu aja gitu.
Iya. Tarik mundur jadinya ya ininya.
Iya.
Nah, iya Bel, kayak yang kemarin saya itu ke mana? Ke lu itu loh, itu kan banyak hal gitu kan, ya nggak mungkin toh kita ngomongin sampai agenda internasional segala macam itu kan.
Nah, kalau yang di paper itu Fis, yang ASP-nya itu
paper yang mana ini?
Yang kita udah dirangkum tadi di sheet yang ketiga itu ya, paper tentang ASP itu, sebagian itu nyebut mengintegrasikan forecasting climate change itu kemudian sama vulnerability. Nah, cuma itu kan berarti kan relying most on BMKG berarti ya?
Iya.
Iya.
Tapi
nah kalau anunya forecasting harus BMKG, nggak bisa.
Tapi menurut
yang lain nggak punya.
Tahu nggak kira-kira BMKG itu seberapa reliable datanya? Kemarin aku ngobrol sama Pak Sultan ya. Prediksi hujan aja meleset mulu gitu.
Oh, itu ini
Indonesia,
Pak. Jadi kalau
Indonesia
dugaan saya itu
satu-satunya
karena ini Pak, karena tropis ya. Jadi agak susah diprediksi. Beda dengan karena
tapi
dia
dalam
dekat
konteks
sama garis.
Ya, tapi dalam konteks ini ya satu-satunya lah, nggak ada alternatif kecuali BMKG, nggak ada lembaga lain yang mampu melakukan itu.
Iya.
Soalnya kan tetap
ya mampu, kita bisa Pak. Cuma dipercaya apa enggak itu.
Ya itu maksud saya, yang dipercaya nasional, alatnya paling lengkap, ya cuma itu. Ya kayak
biarlah
data lah,
mereka
yang paling
bekerja.
reliable, paling bisa dipercaya BPS, sudah soal urusan lain urusan lain.
Pun tadi misalkan kita dari si seasonal calendar itu kita bisa menangkap tuh kerentanan seasonalnya tuh ya. Tapi kan itu juga untuk bisa scalable kan artinya tetap relying data si BMKG itu juga kemungkinan ke depannya juga.
Iya, seasonal itu kan kalau di mana di FGD biasanya itu kan cuma satu musim, terutama 1 tahun terakhir kan gitu mereka.
Itu tadi yang sebenarnya aku tanyain tapi belum ke address ya. Itu seberapa mungkin sih kita tanya mundurnya sejauh apa tuh?
Nah, ya itu paling agak itu nggak mungkin.
Itu lebih ke
5 tahun dulu, perbedaan-perbedaannya 10 tahun lalu gitu kan, apa seperti ini Pak, gitu-gitu. Nggak bisa, year by year ya teler dia lah. Kitanya juga teler. Nanyanya.
Alam kita aja lupa Januari tahun 95 gitu.
Kemarin ngapain gitu kan.
Januari 2019. Bingung.
Kecuali ada yang sering inget itu, ada event-event besar ya yang jadi ingatan kolektif gitu loh, Bos. Kalau jangka lama kayak saya misalnya, masih inget betul saya kapan terakhir ke NTT gitu kan. Ya pas awal pandemi ya, kayak gitu loh. Karena itu pertama kali saya masuk ke
Karena
ruang
jarang
publik.
juga.
Hah?
Iya,
Karena
Iya,
jarang
ada
juga.
momen besar gitu ya.
ada
Waktu
momen
Gunung
besar.
Kelut meletus. Nah,
Nah,
Itu
dulu
aja aku udah
waktu
lupa kapan.
sebelum Gunung Kelut meletus itu panen apa gitu ya.
emang betul, memang begitu. Ingatan kolektif orang itu akan itu.
Tapi kayak
Karena
mostly
ya
bisa
nggak tahu, makin ke sini apa istilahnya, orang cepat lupa itu memang benar juga sih lah. Karena terlalu
maksudnya
banyak kejadian gitu. Jadi hal-hal yang dalam
ya,
tanda petik kurang penting itu nggak melekat di memori.
iya,
Ya,
maksudnya kayak
termasuk
menangkap
capres ini apa ya?
Iya
Dilupakan.
betul. Ingat nggak lo Pilpres tahun 2004 berapa pasangan siapa aja? Lupa pasti udah.
2004
Ya,
SBY JK. SBY
oke.
JK,
Megawati
Mega
Megawati,
Wiranto.
Megawati Wiranto ya bukan nama
Mega
Prabowo.
Hamzah
Wiranto.
bukan
Oh,
sih?
Mega
Bukan ya?
Prabowo, Mega
Mega
Prabowo.
Prabowo, Cek.
Mega Prabowo.
Bukan, Megamati Haji Muzadi waktu itu.
Oh,
Nah,
oh, iya,
Sirot yang
iya, iya.
bener. Yang
Hasyim Muzadi.
2009 itu
Gila ya,
baru
berarti
Mega
dulu
Prabowo.
menggandeng Kiai aja kalah. Oh iya, iya, benar-benar.
Tuh kan, cara tes gini aja susah ya. Dalam peristiwa nasional itu.
Tapi maksudnya menangkap yang kayak dibilang temuan Pak John
Soalnya
di
Hafiz
Flores tadi itu loh.
kebanyakan bikin kode, Pak. Jadinya nggak ingat. Kebanyakan bikin ini dia. Apa itu? Kalau
Sintak.
stata itu sintak.
Enggak, Mas, 2004 aku masih ngerokok ngumpet-ngumpet, Mas.
Oh, oh ya udah terus gimana ini?
Iya, jadi maksudku untuk nangkep yang kayak temuan Pak John di Flores tadi itu loh. Jadi menurut masyarakat itu mereka makin apa tadi corpsnya makin dikit ya kalau nggak salah. Atau gimana sih tadi temuan yang di Flores itu untuk menangkap semacam itu berarti memungkinkan ya. Ya teman-teman kuali pasti udah ahli sih tentang begituan ya. Untuk nangkep pola itu maksudnya kan intinya kita untuk seasonal vulnerability itu ya.
Ya, kita serahkan sama Mas Sultan, sudah ahlinya Mas Sultan itu.
Iya,
Ush.
Mas
Silakan
Sirot
Mas,
ini ikut ke lapangan kan?
tergantung kapannya.
Kemungkinan sih berarti April mungkin ya. Kalau kuanti turun duluan terus sebulan kemudian.
Mas Sirot jadi caleg atau
Ah,
pilkada.
Bukan, itu kan masih masih masa ini soalnya masih masa semester yang agak susah itu.
Kuliahannya.
baru kapan?
Mm-mm.
Juni ya, Rob?
Kapan liburnya Mas Sirot?
Oh,
Juni
Februari, Maret,
biasanya.
Kosong?
April, awal Juni.
Awal Juni betul kan?
Malah akhir
Dan itu
Juni, akhir
sampai
Juni ya malah ya. Aku
pokoknya
tuh
3 bulan kan?
saya kosong itu malah akhir Januari, awal Februari itu kosong. Itu kayak break. Maret, April, Mei, awal Juli baru.
Oh,
Awal Juli ya, sampai
ya udah Mas
September
Sirot
awal itu
duluan
kan
aja ke
libur.
lapangan gitu.
Hah?
Ayo, ayo Rod, asik.
Mas Sirot
Udah lama. Terakhir kita
duluan
itu
ke lapangan.
2010 loh, Rod.
Iya.
Oh, berarti agak berat ya
NPM
kalau
dulu.
Tapi mungkin kalau 1-2 hari kali
Ya kalau cuma pendek gitu ya bisa, tapi kalau pendek itu kan
Bisa
jadi
lah.
nggak efektif.
Satu
Ya
distrik
enggak,
bisa
itu
kali.
aja.
pas waktu lagi ke masyarakat mungkin. Jadi
Nah,
awal-awal kita kan ke
gitu-gitu.
kabupaten, anak-anak kan nggak perlu lah Mas Sirot
Nggak perlu, betul.
pas ke lapangannya. Ini
Biar nggak
juga
lupa itu etnografinya.
semoga juga nanti Pak Sultan lehernya udah sehat ya Pak tahun depan.
Aduh.
Sudah
Mumet kita
masuk
nanti
dulu.
kalau Pak Sultan ya.
Ya Pak, nanti di lapangan jalannya dangak Pak.
Enggak, ini ntar saya tuh belum kenal lah. Ini Jonathan.
Fares
Oh,
panggilannya.
panggilannya Fares ya. Satu lagi
Reski ini
Reski.
Agang. Reski ini Agang.
Hah?
Agang.
Agang
Anak
itu?
magang.
Oke.
Agang. Lalai bikin istilah aneh-aneh juga.
Sama Anabel.
Iya, Mas.
Anabel kuanti atau kualitatif?
Kuali.
Oke, kalau Reski, Fares?
Kuanti.
Fares kuanti. Reski?
Terlima EP Ekonomi Pembangunan di UNER.
Oh, berarti kuantitatif. Oke.
Ya. Iya Mas Sirot, jadi sebenarnya ini kuantitatif itu kita udah ngerjain yang analisis regional itu, kita coba udah developing indeksnya itu. Jadi biar bisa dapat gambaran segera itu ya kemungkinan pemetaan vulnerability map vulnerability level district itu, terus pertimbangan buat milih wilayah gitu. Gitu sih. Tapi kita kan bukan cuma mengandalkan itu ya untuk milih kabupaten. Yang paling utama sih kayaknya juga ngelihat itunya. Melihat komposisi distribusi petani lahan kering sama ini ya, fisheries sama coastal itu. Karena kalau ternyata kita identifikasi kabupaten itu rentan banget, tapi jumlah petani lahan kering sama fisheries-nya dikit banget, ya nggak nemu nanti.
Ya kalau gitu sebelum ke lapangan gini aja, pakai data koran aja.
Media tracking.
Menarik juga itu bisa.
Ya kan? Kan
Ya.
sambil nunggu waktu yang memungkinkan untuk ke lapangan, ya bisa
Ya.
juga dengan sedikit media tracking apa sih yang terjadi di wilayah-wilayah itu.
Yang terutama yaitu Sulsel sama NTT itu ya.
Iya,
NT.
bisa juga begitu.
Oh iya bener itulah waktu itu kapan ya, tahun berapa yang studi tentang dampak krisis 2010 ya, yang finansial global itu loh. Itu kan kita sampai ya media tracking semua koran kita pakai langganan waktu itu sebelum ke lapangan ya.
Berarti nanti Reski bisa bantu tuh kita untuk media tracking
Nah,
ya.
betul media
Soalnya
tracking.
kalau kita kan tenaganya udah nggak ada nih untuk media tracking. Ya, Ki ya. Ki.
Tapi secara umum ini kan sudah kelihatannya sudah oke kan lah ya. Kalau dari saya lihat dari apa tadi itu, dari tabel-tabel yang sangat panjang lebar tadi itu.
Iya, makasih tadi Mas Sirot sudah menegaskan lagi untuk ngekat bagian yang sama dengan kuanti. Itu awal kita udah bilang gitu, tapi Pak John mintanya Kuali juga tetap menggali hal yang sama waktu itu.
Oh gitu ceritanya.
Tadi Mas
Wah.
Sirot untung bring it up, jadi alhamdulillah saya senang
Nggak,
sekali.
sekarang gini aja menurut saya, teman-teman sudah sangat sangat bagus. Kan justru Pak John juga bilang ini kayaknya sangat ekstensif. Saya cuma gini aja. Kadang kita tuh kalau udah sampai detail-detail itu, kadang kita lost in translation, kita dapat
Ya.
apa pohon kecil-kecil tapi nggak tahu gambaran hutan besarnya gitu.
Betul, betul.
Nah mungkin setelah yang besar-besar, yang kecil-kecil tadi itu semua, nah sekarang mulai dipikirkan ini sebenarnya besarnya apa sih gitu. Nah baru itu kemudian bisa lebih mudah untuk meletakkan yang kecil-kecil tadi itu di bawah yang besar, termasuk ini yang nggak perlu mana sih dibuang aja, ya kan? Kalau saran saya sih tadi itu, jadi yang basic pertanyaan pertama, yang vulnerability itu mostly dengan kuantitatif. Pertanyaan yang kedua itu kan mau nggak mau tentang kualitatif kan. Nah, bridgingnya pertanyaan tentang why they vulnerable.
Apa tadi ya? Oke.
Kan? Kemudian tadi kalau di tabel ala ada options adaptasi mereka. Nah, kalau dalam bahasa saya, pertanyaan pertama itu kan kita memahami bagaimana vulnerability itu. Bridgingnya itu adalah bagaimana orang-orang itu mengatasi strategizing, coping with their vulnerability.
Ya.
Pertanyaan bridgingnya kan termasuk dalam bridging itu berarti pertanyaan lala yang adaptation options itu termasuk dalam tadi itu bahasa lain dari bagaimana masyarakat itu coping with atau strategizing dengan climate change, dengan termasuk dengan their own vulnerability. Nah, kemudian pertanyaan yang kedua yang bagaimana adaptive social protection tadi itu kan pertanyaan sebenarnya bahasa lainnya itu bagaimana sih masyarakat dalam hal ini termasuk negara, bagaimana masyarakat dan negara itu satu adalah dealing with climate change, yang kedua adalah membantu masyarakat terutama vulnerable menghadapi climate change. Itu kan pertanyaan untuk yang kedua. Nah, itu tadi yang saya maksud, kita mau meletakkan konsep sosial adaptif itu dalam kerangka tadi itu murni teknokratik, kita paham vulnerability, kemudian berdasarkan teknokrasi kita sarankan, oh ini sebaiknya begini. Atau dalam beberapa hal itu bottom up, kita tanya masyarakat, bagaimana sih mereka selama ini menghadapi vulnerability mereka, apa tantangan mereka, apa kesulitan mereka, termasuk bagaimana program social protection yang ada itu membantu mereka, kurangnya apa, perlu bagaimana. Nah, itu kemudian analisis terhadap itu arahnya ke adaptive social protection. Nah, teman-teman tabel tadi itu sebenarnya sudah mengarah ke situ, ya kan? Itu elemennya sudah ada. Yang beda mungkin framingnya aja.
Paling pertanyaan lanjutannya itu ya, sebenarnya juga yang kaitannya juga sama kuantitatif ya. Jadi setelah kualitatif sudah mengidentifikasi kira-kira arah secara teknokratis mungkin instrumen apa yang bisa dibangun atau dikuatkan untuk mendukung adaptasi masyarakat. Itu kemudian bagaimana targeting mekanisme ya.
Ya.
Itu yang dari awal kita bikin proposal juga mikirin itu. Itu katanya sama kuantitatif ya. Itu tadi masih aku kuningin, belum kebayang sih gimana caranya juga. Ya artinya sebenarnya kalau dari literatur itu tergantung memang spesifik instrumen yang kita mau apa sebenarnya. Dan memang siapa karakteristik secara spesifik orang yang akan kita target. Baru di situ kita bisa mikirin targeting mekanismenya.
Targeting mekanisme itu kan kalau secara konseptual kan begini. Kalau kita menggunakan murni teknokratik, targeting mekanisme itu berarti basicnya adalah indeks vulnerability. Kalau di kemiskinan berarti kan siapa yang tergolong miskin dan siapa yang tergolong enggak. Gitu kan? Kemudian menggunakan itu untuk menyasar siapa yang perlu mendapatkan bantuan. Itu kalau jawabannya murni teknokratik. Dengan menggunakan survei, dengan segala macam, dibikin indeks, kemudian kita tahu, oh ini loh orang-orang yang perlu dibantu. Kemudian dalam climate change berarti kita dari seasonality mereka perlu dibantu pada musim-musim ini. Itu satu hal. Tapi bisa juga targeting mekanisme itu, oke, kita punya indeksnya. Sekarang dari kualitatif kita tanya, orang-orang ini itu gimana sih mereka mengatasi vulnerability mereka? Cara mereka apa aja? Nah, di situ kan sebenarnya pertanyaan tentang mengapa mereka vulnerable. Bisa jadi akan berbeda-beda. Kemudian masyarakat membantu mereka bagaimana? Kemudian sistem yang ada sekarang itu membantu mereka bagaimana, mau dari bantuan panganan tunai, PKH, bantuan langsung tunai misalkan, itu membantu mereka bagaimana, apa yang kurang dari sistem yang ada ini, kemudian menurut masyarakat, kira-kira sebaiknya bagaimana. Nah, mereka kan punya pandangan macam-macam lah, tergantung pengalaman mereka. Nah, baru kemudian di analisisnya, kalau mereka menjawab begitu, berarti kalau dalam bahasa teknokratis itu begini. Mungkin orang-orang peneliti adaptive social protection punya bahasa lain untuk membahasakan itu, termasuk kira-kira secara konseptual, oh mungkin idenya berarti sistem adaptifnya itu mungkin seperti apalah yang berdasarkan temuan. Nah, itu kan dua hal, antara murni teknokratik atau kemudian mendengarkan suara dari warga kira-kira sebaiknya seperti apa. Termasuk juga suara dari pemerintah daerah.
Oke. Iya, lagi juga kita yang targeting mekanisme itu kita juga tidak menjanjikan terlalu banyak kok. Kalaupun misalkan ujungnya itu cuma kita merekomendasikan tambahan set, ya pokoknya rekomendasi set indikator yang bisa dipertimbangkan untuk mengidentifikasi siapa yang rentan terhadap perubahan iklim ya, yang selama ini kan memang sama sekali belum dikonsider ya dalam life cycle social protection. Jadi kayaknya sih itu sudah cukup sih menurutku. Perlu ada studi lanjutan lah kalau untuk spesifik tentang targeting mekanismenya itu.
Ya, ya, ya. Kalau yang aku pahami berarti tadi itu, oke, kita menyarankan atau mengusulkan adaptive social protection, tapi dalam masih formula dasar kan. Kira-kira alternatif yang bisa dipilih apa aja. Tidak sampai pada, oh ini loh yang paling efektif berdasarkan studi yang dilakukan.
Ya. Masih, ya kemarin kan di outcome-nya kita bilang options ya.
Oke.
Options. Oke, kalau begitu teman-teman, kayaknya sekarang nih kita perlu fokus dua hal ya. Jadi fokus kok dua hal. Yang pertama kita harus mulai nulis inception paper-nya buat draft. Tapi itu sebenarnya sih lebih ke administratif ya. Jadi ya pokoknya kita submit lah. Terus yang kedua itu sebenarnya menyiapkan presentasi ke Bu Vivi ya untuk riset desain ini. Pendekatannya sih aku setuju kayak yang Mas Rod tadi ya. Tetap kita mulai dari ujungnya dulu. Bayangan kita tentang instrumen ASP itu kayak apa, sebenarnya berdasarkan literatur. Artinya memang dari situ kemudian kita akan menggali apa gitu. Jadi sebenarnya yang kita presentasikan ke Bu Vivi lebih ke desain sih.
Inception report itu tanggal deadline-nya kapan, Lala?
7 Oktober draftnya.
7 Oktober. Sekarang sudah
13 September sekarang.
Enggak, sudah di draft.
Outline-nya udah.
Oh, mantap kalau gitu.
Outline-nya aja. Tapi sebenarnya outline yang kemarin juga dibikin sama Hafiz itu menurutku yang the best ya, yang paling ideal. Maksudku untuk nanti final inception paper mungkin bisa, tapi kalau untuk draft ya setidaknya kita narasikan dari yang Excel tadi aja itu sudah cukup lah untuk tanggal 7 Oktober.
Inception atau interim? Apa interim ya? Apa istilahnya?
Inception sih, Bu Hopo. Interim kan diantara kayak. Kalau inception
Ya iya, itu biasanya kan laporan apa ya, administrasi apa yang sudah kita lakukan ya, cerita-cerita begitu doang, bukan itu.
Bukan. Enggak sih Pak, ini lebih ke draft research design sebenarnya. Jadi fokusnya di research design. Terus utamanya kan nanti di workshop di tengah Oktober itu yang rancangan.
Yang dengan Bu Vivi.
Bukan, itu dengan stakeholders, kita workshop bentuknya. Di situ kita mendiskusikan lebih jauh tentang rancangan desain kita ini. Gitu.
Oke.
Nanti Abel izin biar ini ya Mas, kontak Mas Sirot langsung ya kalau ada pertanyaan spesifik tentang
Oke. Iya. Oke ya, selamat ya. Iya. Selamat udah makin berkembang dan keren gitu.
Amin, semoga timnya bertahan sampai akhir. Biasanya along the way merodoli Mas.
Ada suhunya, Mas Sultan yang akan menjaga.
Enak ya.
Iki khawatirnya malah Mas Sultan yang merodoli di sini. Makanya Mas Sultan sehat-sehat ya.
Nah, kalau leher saya tetap teler gini mana bisa.
Makanya lehernya tengkleng.
Ya,
Pak Sultan itu memang sudah waktunya pensiun, Pak.
Nah, kepikiran juga gitu,
pensiun.
Baru 45 masa pensiun sih?
Luar biasa.
Wah, amin. Wow, berarti anu ya Rod ya, physically masih itu ya.
Masih strong.
Seperti 45 atau semangatnya 45 lah ya.
Masih strong, Mas.
Mantap.
Oke, makasih banyak.
Oke ya, iya sama-sama, makasih.
Terima kasih banyak, Mas Sirot, Mbak Lala dan teman-teman. Live ya.